My interest in this work goes back a long way, and one of the concepts that got me really intrigued with it is the notion of transformative assets. And we came up with that notion by talking to a lot of families. It actually was a sample of about 200 families that we talked to, and asking them to think about how they were planning for their own betterment and for providing a leg up in life for their children, a good head start. And what invariably came back from families who had any kind of financial assets was the way that they were going to help them in terms of often private schools or moving to communities that had much better or at least higher quality rated schools, and even thinking about already the kinds of colleges and universities they could get into, and maybe even thinking about the first time home ownership. And so we began to think about transformative assets are the kind of financial assets that allow an individual or a family to jump up several steps as if they're on an escalator in terms of their own social mobility and their own betterment. And the notion for me of transformative assets also has to do with it represents that kind of financial wealth that the paycheck can't get us to. It represents maybe a first-time down payment on a house that's passed on from a parent or grandparent that, even though we've got good jobs and are well educated, it's tough to buy a home in the United States these days. And that kind of help is transformative in that way. It jumps a family, if you will, up a class. And so I think that for us helped to capture that notion. That's the really critical point that we get to. It's not for us just about the concept of transformative assets, but it's thinking through who has the opportunity to have that happen in their lives. And is that random? And of course the answer is no, it is not random. It has very much to do with a long historical legacy of race in the United States and policy going back a long period in our own history in the United States, and what the labor market returns. So it really encompasses an idea around sedimentation of inequality, so that if we ask in our past and not so distant past, African Americans, for example, weren't allowed to own property in communities where they could build a business, where they could create equity in a home and pass that on. So all of that kind of gets rolled into the notion of transformative assets, and then the critical question is asking, I really do wish everybody had them or had access to them, but unfortunately we don't, and it is a way that social inequality and inequality gets passed along. We've been doing a lot of work on the racial wealth gap. I, in conjunction with my early collaborators, Melvin Oliver and others, have been looking at the racial wealth gap for, I'm going to smile because it's been over 20 years now. And luckily I think for the nation, some of this now is beginning to seep into public policy conversations, and we're trying to drive ahead with it very deeply. When we started to look at what the racial wealth gap is at any point in time, we have a good metric. We know what that metric is, and the studies will differ a little bit, but it's about the average African American family has about 6 cents in wealth for every dollar of wealth that the average white family has. And that's been pretty standard across studies. It replicates and validates that finding. It's a structure, it's a pattern we know. The question for us became, does that gap close over time? Does it widen over time? Or does it just stay at the same pace over time? So we took a look, and it took us a while to do this, but we were able to get a hold of some really good information from a nationally representative survey that looked at a lot of African American and white families. We looked at it at first in 1984, and then rechecked it every 4 years as the interviews were redone up until 2009. And we're just updating it now, but that's a different story. And the story that the data tells us, what the evidence tells us, is that the racial wealth gap increased almost threefold, and that's in constant dollars over that 25-year period. Then the question becomes, okay, it's increasing, things are going in the wrong direction to what we would like it to see. we obviously need to make a U-turn. We need to stop the harm that's being done first. We have to grab a hold of what's driving that increase. What's it about? So we went into the data, and it's some relatively sophisticated statistical techniques that allow us to say that home ownership is by far and away the number one driver in the widening racial wealth gap over the last decade, over the last 25 years, last generation, for the same set of families. And it accounts for almost 27% of the difference in wealth growth between typical or average white families and typical or average African American families. And the dynamics around home ownership are very robust in the United States. It has to do with residential segregation. It also can represent, and it does in a lot of instances, first-time home buyers. If we go back to transformative assets, some people are really fortunate in that they come from families that can help them make that a down payment on a first home. And that happens much more often in white families than it does in African American families. It doesn't happen in all white families, but when it does, its frequency is about 4 times as often as it is in African American families. So there are all kinds of dynamics around policies and structures around home ownership. At the end of the day, if we're only talking about wealth, we also live in homes, but if you're only talking about the wealth that the home creates for the family, it is by far the largest driver of the racial wealth gap. I became very passionate about issues of inequality, specifically racial inequality, growing up. I grew up at a time in the mid-1960s when the civil rights movement was coming to fruition. I grew up in Los Angeles. I remember vividly the events around Watts in South Central Los Angeles, 1965. And I remember being horrified, not just at the event, but maybe even more so at the response to the event. And hearing some of what we become to know as the dominant narratives, kind of finding early pillars then around character deficits and behavioral deficits in an entire group of African Americans. And the bias that's involved in those kinds of explanations. And then beginning to understand, I go off to college then, quite literally in the fall of 1965, and I begin to try and seriously understand why events like that in the civil rights movement happen. I end up majoring in sociology, which is probably irrelevant to my personal story. But it does represent an endearing and persistent passion about social justice that come both from the life experience I have as an individual growing up where I did, and I would add one other personal event here. When I was a juvenile, age 17, I was arrested for something I did not do at the time. And I went through the juvenile justice system, and it was a pretty terrifying and horrific experience. And especially realizing that, in fact, I didn't do it. I didn't do this. And I think a lot of empathy gets solidified in real, concrete experiences like that, where you think twice when you hear people talk about, well, I didn't do it, or something's not right, or something's not fair, when it's happened in your life as well. Now, I'm sure other people have similar experiences and come out politically, philosophically in other places, and I suppose that's part of what makes this a great society. We can have different experiences and come out with similar or different philosophies about it. But that's where my passion comes from in it. I would start with democracy. I would start with the W.E.B. Du Bois notion that the color line in American society is about our movement towards or away from democracy. And I think our progress on racial inequality, on the racial wealth gap in particular, is an incredibly good benchmark for us to think about that. we've grown up in a society where race is in our constitutional DNA. I don't think there are very many other societies where it literally is in their constitutional DNA. So it's something we have had to deal with in American society over a long period of time. And I think that the next steps clearly are before us if we want to continue the march, which I think it has been over a long period of time, a march towards democracy, that this is really critical. Economically, I think the nation is deprived by holding back the capacity of entire groups of people, not just African Americans, Latinos, Asian and Pacific Islanders, indigenous peoples in the United States. I think we deprive our communities and our nation of a lot of talent, a lot of creativity, and a lot of innovation. And if the economics were more equitable, I think we would, I know we would see a lot more economic growth, and on a level that is also more equitable and more beneficial for communities involved. So I think there are a lot of, I think I'm short-circuiting a lot of important points, but I would start with the values, which I think are really critical. I think the economic component is important, and certainly not last and not least, the moral imperative, which I think is really critical. Just about how a society treats its most vulnerable population is an indicator of it's a weather vane of our moral stance.